Hello, and welcome to week 43 of our 2 year Bible study. We pick up again in 2 Samuel chapter 22, where we have a psalm of David that he sang when the Lord had delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So we see David praising God in the midst of a time of deliverance here. And as you read through the song, this particular song, it's not actually a psalm, but this particular song, we see that nature is an inkling of the power of God, who is always going to bring those faithful to God to victory. And so David had certainty both when he was in distress and then he praises God after he has been delivered from that distress because of God's faithfulness. As you move on to 2 Samuel chapter 23, we see that David has his final words, and um, certainly appropriately enough, the final words of David are a song declaring the Davidic covenant. So it's a reminder that God has made this promise to him. And when we couple Psalm 22 with Psalm 23, you see the two of them are linked with each other. David has seen God's faithfulness in the past by delivering him, and now David looks to the future and the Davidic covenant that is not yet fulfilled, but is trusting that God is going to fulfill it because he is faithful. The end of this chapter lists off the mighty men of David. These are um, the men of honor and valor within his army, probably the leaders of different units within his army as well. As we move on to Psalm chapter 24, we see that um, this, I think, clearly happens earlier in David's reign. So I don't think that this is actually near the end of David's reign, but it sets up for the location of the temple in Jerusalem, which is what the narrative is moving towards. So you might see Second Samuel chapter 24 as kind of a flashback, but then explaining why the temple is going to be where it is. Um, and oftentimes we might wonder, well, why is this such a big deal? The census that David is taking here. And I think it's important for us to think of it in simple terms first, and then we can apply it to the national terms here that David has. So, if I were to come into your house and count all your coffee mugs in your cabinet and take an inventory of them and write that inventory down, and then go onto your cups and your plates and count all your forks and all your knives, you would be a bit put off by that because you take an inventory of what is yours. In the same way, God said that a census could only be taken if God commanded the census, because you only take a census of what is yours. Israel belongs to God. So a census could only come at the command of God, and a ransom would need to be paid to God during that census. We read that in Exodus chapter 30, verse 12. So David taking the census without a ransom put Israel at risk of being unholy before God. And so God says that there are three options that David can take in terms of the punishment that David or that God is going to bring. Verse 13, God says, "Shall there come on you 3 years of famine in your land, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land?" And David trusts more on the mercy of God than in the trust of people. A 3 year famine would probably put the people against David, clearly fleeing from his enemies, puts him at the risk of the hands of people. But a 3 day plague is something that can come and go quickly. And David says, "I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great. Do not let me fall into the hands of humans." So David trusts more in the mercy of God than he trusts in people. And so the plague begins, and as the plague moves along, somehow it is visible in some sense. Uh, David sees it moving and goes to Aruna in verses 18 and 19, and um, says that. that he wants to buy Aruna's threshing floor so that he can build an altar to the Lord that the plague on the people may be stopped in verse 21. And Aruna, kind of seeing the plague moving closer and closer, is pretty much like, let the king take whatever he wants if that's going to stop the plague. And then David responds in a very curious way because as king, he could have done that. He could have taken the land, the cattle, the wood, anything that he needed as king. He could just take that. But look in verse 24, he says, but the king replied to Aruna, no, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. I think this is an important element of our understanding of our sacrifice, our offerings. Sometimes people call it our tithing. The sacrifice must cost something. So there are times when people are very, very poor and they aren't able to give. The tithe is typically considered to be 10%, but they can't give 10% because it's just not within their means to be able to. And yet, if they give in a sacrificial way, that is a good offering to God. On the other hand, there are people who make, let's say, over $100,000 a year, and that $10,000 a year likely isn't nearly enough because they're really not sacrificing anything. When we only give out of our pocket change, God doesn't need our pocket change. Our sacrifice, our offerings, our tithes must cost us something. And so tying it down to a particular percentage is probably not wise. And we're a few hundred years from there, but when we get to 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, we're going to see that Paul takes pretty much the same stance as well. Well, in Psalm 57, we read about when David had fled from Saul into the cave. And although David's enemy sets traps, God will rescue. And so we need not worry about what our enemies are doing. We can trust in God to rescue us. And then Psalm 95, probably a Psalm of David, but talks about how God deserves our worship and our faithfulness, for without him there is no rest. And so the worship and faithfulness doesn't in some way pay for our rest or in some way um, do a quid pro quo with God. Rather, God deserves our worship and faithfulness. It's a proper response to what he has done for us. And without that worship and faithfulness, we cannot possibly find rest. As we move ahead to Psalm chapter 97, we see that God also deserves our worship and his power will rescue his people. So, again, when we respond appropriately to God in worship for what he has done, we can trust that his power is going to rescue his people from whatever trial that they find themselves in. In Psalm 98, we read that the Lord's justice will come and all will rejoice. And I think when we talk about justice in Scripture, sometimes we have a hard time understanding why would we want God's justice to come. That seems like a day of wrath, a day of punishment, a day of many times described with blood and war and dying. However, I think when we link justice with hope, we can begin to understand why we would look forward to the day of the Lord's justice coming. When we don't believe that tomorrow can change from what it is today, when we can't believe that things will be set right at one point, we fall into hopelessness. And so, justice, knowing that things are going to be set right one day, provides hope to us. And so, the Lord's justice, his future hope, will come, and thus we can rejoice in God today. When we get to Psalm chapter 99, we read that even in our sinfulness, we should want to see God's justice so that we can see him. So this is kind of linked with the psalm that we just read, Psalm 98. So, of course, there are times when we are looking for God to set everything right because we live in a broken world and people sin against us. But even in our own sinfulness, we should want to see God's justice because we want to see him. And so we're trusting on his mercy. We're trusting on his faithfulness to forgive us of that sinfulness. And of course, that happens ultimately through Jesus Christ. And so we can want to see God's justice even in the midst of our own sinfulness. Well, if we turn back to First Chronicles chapter 21, we see that in uh, First Chronicles chapter 21, it says that Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. In Second Samuel 24, verse 1, it says there that the anger of the Lord burned against Israel and he incited David against them. So is it God or is it Satan? And 2 Samuel 24, verse 1 is a passive verb without someone being identified. So while most versions indicate God, it could, in agreement with First Chronicles 21, verse 1, be Satan. Perhaps a better reading would be again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel and incited David against them. This would mean, rather than putting the he in there or the God in there in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1, because the verb doesn't really suggest a particular person, this could mean that the anger of the Lord is burning against Israel, and part of the punishment is that he's going to allow Satan to rise up against Israel and to incite David to take the census of Israel. Either way, there are times that God allows evil to proceed in order to accomplish his purposes, which, of course, remain holy. Additionally, there are some differences in the numbers between First Chronicles 21 and Second Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. For fighting men, there seems to be a distinction between valiant men, so maybe we might think of it like veterans, and men who could draw the sword. Those are noobs. These are new people in the army. So there seems to be a distinction between those. And for Judah numbers, it could be a rounding to 100,000 versus 10,000, or it could be a knowledge of the number of mustered men in Benjamin, right next to Jerusalem, being added in because Benjamin doesn't seem to be counted as the circular path that Joab took in counting men left Benjamin for last. And of course, they're not counting Levi, perhaps because they're scattered throughout Israel, and for their by this point they're kind of taking on more of a spiritual role rather than a military role, although they certainly were involved in military skirmishes, certainly in the book of Joshua and as they wandered in the desert. Verse 14 um, uh, in First Chronicles chapter 21 says, "So the Lord sent a plague on Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell dead." This is based on David's actions, and really Joab and the rest of the court, David's royal court. They knew they shouldn't have been taking this census, and yet they went ahead and did it anyhow. And so the actions of leaders influence the lives of people, and we oftentimes don't recognize sometimes the ripple effects of our sin, certainly in leadership roles, because of the influence that they have over people, but even in our own individual lives. My sin ripples out into the lives of others. Your sin ripples out into the lives of others as well. And there is always a consequence to that sin. In First Chronicles chapter 22, the story establishes the temple site in Jerusalem, which we read about as Arunia's threshing floor, and David makes preparations for its construction. As we move over to the Psalms again, we see that David writes a psalm of dedication for the temple. And what's interesting in this psalm is that David is essentially saying, "Rescue me so that I might sing new praises to you." But it's not like David is withholding the new praises until God rescues him, because essentially he says, "Rescue me so I might sing new praises. But until then, I'm going to praise you." In other words, I'm going to trust that you are going to rescue me and act in a way that reflects that trust in God. When we go to Psalm 108, we see a call for God to remember his people and his enemies. And so, again, we have this idea of faithfulness of God to his people and God's justice coming. In Psalm 109, we see that while vengeance is desired, it is left in the Lord's hands. And this is where this is an important way for us to make sure that we're reading the Psalms. There's a call for vengeance on our enemies in the Psalms. Now, I would suggest that our enemy is primarily Satan and the demonic forces and Our enemy is sin and death, and so we want vengeance on those enemies. New Testament tells us that our fight is not against flesh and blood, and so we should be gracious to those around us. But there is a vengeance that's desired on our enemy Satan, who has caused all this sin all the way back in the garden and has not yet felt the full retribution of that justice. But even if we are calling on vengeance against evil people in this world, it is to be left in the Lord's hands. God will make sure that vengeance comes in appropriately and in a way that is just. When we get to Psalm 110, we get another Psalm of David, but he here is pronouncing the future priest king. And so you'll remember that in Israel, the Levites and really only the offspring, the sons of Aaron, could be a priest. And the king came from Judah, so David. And Judah is not Levi, and so you can't have a priest king. And yet, David sees in the future this priest king, but not based on offspring of Aaron and offspring of Judah, but instead offspring of Judah, and then a priest like Melchizedek. And you'll remember that we read about Melchizedek in Genesis, and he was a priest king. He was a priest king in what would become Jerusalem. And Abraham, who's the father of Aaron and the Levites, Abraham gives his tithe to Melchizedek. And so David sees Melchizedek as this true priest who is outside the Jewish heritage and also a king in Jerusalem. And David is looking forward to that king, the king who will be both an offspring of Judah, but then also be a priest in the priesthood of Melchizedek. What this does tell us is that God was at work even outside of his chosen people, Israel, to reveal himself to people, and that people responded appropriately. If Melchizedek is in Jerusalem as a priest, surely there is a temple and an entire ritual practices that surround all of that. And he is a true priest of the Most High God, even though he's not from the Abrahamic lineage. And so we can see that God reveals himself. He's not constrained by how he reveals himself, and oftentimes reveals himself in ways that we don't anticipate.